Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Erica Malhart, and today we're going to be talking about feed consumption and feed composition. So today, the first half of the lecture, we're going to cover feed consumption. So what kind of factors are affecting feed intake? What tells an animal to start eating? How appetizing is that food? What tells an animal to stop eating? What are these certain factors that affect this feed intake, right? How do we increase it? How do we decrease it? Those types of things. And then for the second half of the lecture, we're going to talk about types of feed. So forages, roughages, which are really for our herbivores, concentrates, whether that's energy, protein, those types of things, and other things that we may find in feed. So that's what we're going to cover today. So let's start with our feed consumption. So these factors that are going to influence feed consumption. So we have a couple of terms here that we're going to cover. The first being palatability, hunger versus appetite, right? So a lot of people interchange hunger and appetite, but they're really kind of two different things. And then we're going to talk about taste as well. So first we're going to cover palatability. So this is really the degree of acceptance to the taste by an animal. So, you give them a couple of options and they may pick one over the other, and it's probably due to the palatability of the food. And there's a lot of factors that can influence palatability, right? So, a lot about taste, but maybe even odor, appearance, texture, temperature, right? Hot or cold, and other sensory properties. So we're going to kind of talk about what animals actually care about, what affects their palatability, what makes them want to eat it, maybe not want to eat it, okay? So now we're going to compare hunger versus appetite. So hunger is really just triggered by a physiological need, right? So you need energy, you need to survive. So that physiological need for food is going to trigger that hunger response. And this is satisfied by calories. So anything that has calories has energy and is going to satisfy that need versus appetite. Now, appetite is triggered by a desire to repeat a certain experience, a pleasant experience. So, this not only applies to food, it can apply to many other things, right? But for this class, we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about food. So, when you eat something that was really good and really tasty, really palatable, you maybe want to eat it again, whether you're hungry or not. You had a pleasant experience from eating that food. So this can cause, a series of different behaviors, especially seen in humans, domestic animals, even some captive animals, where, you're not necessarily hungry, but, that cookie just sounds really, really good. The last time I ate a cookie, it was delicious, right? So it's satisfied by palatability. You eat something that's really tasty and you just want to keep eating it regardless of your state of physiological need, right? So the last one we're going to talk about is taste. So taste is the actual ability to sense these chemicals that are dissolved in the saliva. Once you eat something, right, you're going to break down the food and those chemicals in the food are going to be dissolved in the saliva. And then your taste buds on your tongue are going to pick up those chemicals, and you have those chemoreceptors in your tongue, in those taste buds, and those are going to carry that chemical signal to your brain and tell you what you tasted, right? So we've got our four different tastes, sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and those are kind of our four main taste types, right? And The number of taste buds that we have on our tongue, various species have different number of taste buds, but that doesn't necessarily mean, the higher number of taste buds, the higher sensitivity you have to taste. So they don't necessarily correlate, okay? But that's how we pick up taste. It's really a chemical sense, right? So we're going to pick up those chemicals and send it to the brain and say, hey, we tasted something sweet, right? Or we tasted something salty. Now, when we talk about flavor and taste, right, it's really only important when we're given a choice of food or a choice of feed. So, if we say, hey, would I rather eat, a nice salty potato chip, or would I rather eat a cookie or a sweet cookie, you can make that decision. Whereas if you are just given your food, you don't really have a choice. You're going to just eat it for your physiological need. So they have done multiple tests though to kind of see if animals have a preference of the different tastes. And just kind of going through this list, right, you kind of see that, a lot of animals probably prefer sweet, us and humans being one of them, right? Sugar is fairly addictive. It causes an appetite, right? You want to eat more sugar. So, sheep, cattle, pigs are very similar to humans in their taste. So we really like the sweet. And cattle kind of respond a little bit to sour as well. They moderately will choose or prefer sour as well. Now, when you look at some other animals, though, like chickens, for example, and cats, there's really, chickens actually have a negative response for sweet. They prefer animal or plant products, which would maybe go towards the salty side. So that's kind of interesting as well. And you think of cats, being carnivores, they have no preference for sweet. So if you were to give them something, they would not necessarily pick it because it was sweet. And goats just eat everything, so they actually prefer all of them. So they don't have a preference for one over the other. So what about the other senses that may or may not affect feed consumption? So some of these things may affect it and they may not. So let's look through. So another sense that we have is sense of smell, right? So again, we're picking up chemical compounds or these volatile compounds in the air that dissolve into your nasal mucosa, and then you pick up that chemical in your nose and send it to your brain. And this may serve as an attractant, right? You smell a really good tasting food and it triggers salivation. And so, it may be an attractant, but odor doesn't necessarily influence the total food being consumed. You'll probably eat the same amount of food as you would have before, okay? Now, sight, for animals, it's really only used to help locate their food. So you think of birds, right? Birds have really good sense of sight. So they're going to hunt, right? And a lot of predators have very good sight. So it doesn't necessarily affect how they choose their food. So they did a study to look at color, and color does not have an effect on their choice of food. But again, some animals don't see in color as well as humans, but because maybe color or sight may affect a human's choice, but not necessarily in the animal world. But texture definitely can affect palatability. So, especially when we're talking about dust. So, almost all animals will discriminate against dust, meaning they will prefer to eat something that's not dusty and not dried out over something that is really maybe a little more moist, a little higher in moisture. So they do prefer these succulent feeds or higher moisture content feeds over dry or dusty feeds. So now let's talk about the control mechanisms for feed intake. So what actually affects or is telling us, how much food to eat, when to stop eating? What is this regulation and control over food intake or feed intake? So if you talk about kind of your overall body energy, right? You have some regulatory factors over that whole body energy. And that's a combination of external factors and internal factors. So some of these external factors we may talk about are your environment, right? So what kind of environment do you live in? Are you wild? Are you domestic? How scarce is food? That type of stuff. Sensory information, right? Kind of the stuff we talked about for palatability, right? Smell, taste, those types of sensory informations coming in from the outside. And diet composition, right? What is the food actually made up of? These are all external factors that may affect your body energy. And the internal factors, you have your metabolic rate, right? So some species have much higher metabolic rates than others. They need to eat a lot more food to have more energy, right? To keep that higher metabolism going. Hormones, right? The hormones are a big regulatory factor. When you spike your blood glucose levels, right, that's going to trigger hormone release and things like that. So there are these hormonal factors that are causing some control over feed intake, telling you to eat more or eat less. So when we talk about the control mechanism, the primary site for control is the central nervous system, right? So the brain is really the one that's going to be controlling your food intake. So it's really integrating, what you're taking in, what type of food, what type of energy are you taking in, and the energy needs of your body, right? That total body energy balance. So there is a short-term control and a long-term control for feed intake, right? So short-term can be very different, just depending on species, individual. Do you eat many meals throughout the day, or do you eat one big meal, right? So the short-term control can be variable. But overall control, the long-term control is really needed for energy balance and survival. So you don't want to eat too much food to become fat. You want to eat enough food so you're not thin, right? So this whole idea of energy balance. And if we take a look at our little picture over here, you guys don't need to memorize any of this stuff, but I just thought this was a good overall little picture to kind of show how we do that, right? So if we have a positive energy balance, right, we eat some food, you're going to trigger the insulin release, and leptin is another hormone just released from fat. And these guys are really going to tell your body, say, hey, we've had enough food, decrease the food intake because we already have enough energy, we're going to gain some weight, right? Versus if you have a negative energy balance, right, you have low hormone levels, and it's going to trigger this effect of, hey, we need to increase our food intake because we need to gain a little weight, we need some energy. So again, we have this very good balancing system to, take in more energy, or if we have enough energy to tell us to stop. So the primary control, we said, is definitely within the brain. But if we look more specifically at our short-term control, and this is really talking about right around feeding time, right around meal time, we're talking about the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus specifically is in the brain. It's in the diencephalon, and it's really the overall control system of the endocrine system of the body. And the endocrine system is what is releasing all the hormones from the various glands throughout the body. So the hypothalamus is getting all this feedback information from the body, and then it's telling those different glands to secrete these different hormones. So it has control over the initiation of feeding, when we start to eat, but also it inhibits eating, so it tells us when to stop eating, trying to prevent overeating. So there is this humoral control, we call it, and this is via those hormones and metabolites. So the hormones, just a couple of them that we've talked about, insulin before, in response to glucose. So when the glucose, which is a metabolite, is released from the food that we eat, our blood glucose levels rise, and then we secrete insulin. And that stimulation to secrete insulin is coming from the hypothalamus. Okay, so glucose is really important in non-ruminant species. And then another metabolite, those free fatty acids we've talked about before, are really important in ruminants. So once those free fatty acids are released, that triggers a similar response in the hypothalamus in ruminants. So just to kind of get an idea, and you don't need to know all these different hormones and everything, but it just gives us an idea of what's kind of going on with this control system. Now, long-term control, we're not going to really talk about, what specifically, what region of the brain it's happening in. But when we look at wild animals, or most animals in general, they tend to maintain a very stable, healthy body weight. And you're talking about humans and maybe some domestic species, which are really our cause of not maintaining a stable body weight. There's various reasons for that. We have so much access to food. If you look at this graph over here, that's why I have the graph. And of course, you don't need to know all the details of it, but it just shows, time on the x-axis and then calories available per person, essentially on the y-axis. And just over time, we just see this huge increase in calories available per person. So, the food available to us is just ridiculous. Out in the wild, you're looking for food, you're scavenging, you're hunting. So it's a very different world out in the real environment. But we do see the seasonal changes as well in some species. So, sometimes, in the winter, the bears pack on, more fat for the winter. Different species have maybe these different seasonal changes. So you can talk about some control, maybe being in that pineal gland in the brain, which secretes melatonin. And melatonin is really responsible for those circadian rhythms, those seasonal changes. Okay, but that's all we'll really talk about in terms of long-term control. But there has to be this long-term control to maintain kind of a stable body weight throughout the animal's lifetime. So something that definitely affects feed intake is behavior or feeding behavior. So we have these different groups of animals that we consider, omnivores, herbivores, carnivores, and really we're talking a lot about, not only what they eat, but how they eat as well. So omnivores, just for example, pigs and humans are very similar in how they eat. And essentially we have these periodic short meals, and there are these inter-meal intervals, right? So we have these spaces or spans of time between our meals that we are not eating. And so just the short-term signaling here, the control, is GI distension, right? So you eat a meal, the food fills up your stomach, and that's going to send a signal to your brain that, hey, we've had enough food, we are good to go. And this may be different from some of our other animal friends, right? So when we talk about herbivores, we're talking about very high cellulose diets, right? And this cellulose takes a lot longer to break down. So when we were talking about our omnivores, right, we're breaking down usually carbohydrates into soluble carbohydrates into our sugars, right? So our glucose. And that's going to have a very pretty immediate feedback to the brain with our blood glucose levels. Whereas herbivores, it's a real slow energy release from the food. So they have to break down this food, use all of that gut microbes to help them break down all this cellulose. And that takes a lot longer. So what essentially they are eating smaller but more frequent meals. If you think about herbivores or grazers, they essentially are eating little, mouthfuls of feed all day long. They're moving, they're eating, they're moving, they're eating. And so because they need that time to break down all of that cellulose. And the process of breaking down all that cellulose is actually slowed down with large amounts of food in their GI tract. So they don't want large meals. And you can see problems with some of these domesticated species, especially horses that we've domesticated. And essentially now we feed them, 2 large meals, maybe 3 a day. And they have this huge amount of food in their system. And that causes them to colic, essentially. They're not meant to digest all of that large amount of food in a short period of time. They're supposed to be eating these smaller meals more frequently. And so once they break down that food, that cellulose, they use those free fatty acids to signal satiation versus, glucose. So they have the microbial breakdown and fermentation processes that produce these free fatty acids that signal the brain, hey, we're satiated. Now, when we're talking about carnivores, this is kind of opposite to our herbivores. These guys are eating very high protein, high fat diets, right? They're eating usually full carcasses in the wild at the very least. And so these guys have fairly infrequent but larger meals. And, predators, they may have scarce access to prey, right? They have to kind of eat as much as they can while they can. So they are able to tolerate these larger meals and they can break them down in their GI system fairly well. So let's look at another thing that affects our feed intake, and that's energy density of the food. So when we're talking about energy density of food, that's how much energy or how many calories are in a food, right? So as the energy density increases, so the more calories, the less you have to eat, right? So then the feed intake decreases. So fats tend to be more energy dense, right? And then proteins and then carbs. So you don't have to eat as many fats as you do carbs to get the same amount of energy. So again, we've got a little graph here and I've added it into your notes because I think it's fairly important to just see the relationship between the energy density and the feed. So the amount of feed or gain is on our x-axis, and then the energy density is on the y-axis. So if we look at this, our lower energy dense food are going to be higher on the feed gain axis. That means we have to eat more of the lower energy food. And then as the energy density increases, these higher energy foods, we don't have to eat as many of them, right? So a lot less on the x-axis. So another thing that affects food intake or feed intake is bulk density. So we've already covered energy density. As the energy density increases, the feed intake decreases. Well, that's pretty similar to bulk density as well, but now bulk density, we're talking about weight per volume, okay? So as we increase bulk or volume, we're going to decrease the density or the weight, okay? Now, we can talk about energy as well when we talk about bulk density, and energy is directly correlated with density. So that means if you increase the density, you also increase the energy that is consumed, okay? So there's a direct correlation between this bulk density and energy. So we can talk about bulk density in reference to some of the feeds that we have as well. So we're going to go through more of these feeds in the second half of the lecture. But roughage, is really our, hays are kind of our bulky feeds. So these are considered bulk feeds. So they have a high volume but a low density. Okay, so these roughages are fairly bulky feeds and they have a lower energy. So lower energy consumed when the animals eat this roughage. So the pretty high fiber, low density diets. This is opposite to our processed feeds. So anytime we process a food, right? So we make, these grasses and things into pellets, or we chop them, or we ground them up, and essentially it's a low volume, right? So low volume but high density. And so these guys are going to have a higher energy that is consumed, these processed feeds, right? So they are less bulky feeds. So in general, we already kind of talked about this. Animals tend to maintain a stable body weight. And when we talk about young animals, they tend to grow at kind of a uniform rate. Now, at the point when an animal reaches its energy demand, right? It's eaten enough food, it's met its energy needs, its caloric density. Now, this point is variable, right? So it's not the same for every animal or every species, right? Every individual is different. So this depends on age, right? If you're growing, you need more food, right? Depending on the species. Or is the animal in production, right? So if it's a production animal, it's going to need more feed as well. So we've been talking about factors that are affecting feed intake or things that are controlling feed intake. Well, now we're going to talk a little bit about things that are going to inhibit feed intake, or how do we maybe have some weight loss strategies? How do we decrease that food intake or the energy intake as well? So we can increase our energy dense foods. So we talked about if we increase our energy dense foods, we're going to decrease the intake. So these proteins and these fats that are high energy foods, we can increase those so we overall decrease the intake. Another way to do this is called caloric dilution. And essentially we're going to just increase the bulk density of the food. So remember we said that bulk density has to do with weight and volume. So the more volume the food has, the more bulk it has, the lower the density it has, and the lower the energy it has. Okay? So if we increase this roughage that is a high bulk density food, then we're going to decrease the ingestion of calories, the ingestion of energy. So some other ways we can inhibit feed intake is we can make the feed less palatable, right? So if the animal doesn't want to eat it, it's going to eat less of it, right? So you can do this by a couple different ways. You can add dust. We already discussed how most animals have an aversion to dust. You can add these different substances such as ammonium sulfate, quinine, and salt. Obviously, you have to be somewhat careful with some of these other additives because different animals have different tolerances, especially salt. So anyways, that's a way to make it less palatable, right? And then the obvious way is to just restrict the feed altogether, right? So feed less food, less calories to the animal. So we've been talking about all these different things, these different factors that are going to affect feed intake. But how can we actually predict how much food the animal is actually going to eat? We've talked about different equations for how to calculate the energy demands and the maintenance requirements for these different animals. So we've already talked about body weight and how that affects their feed intake, but it's not a linear relationship. If we kind of go back to that equation, we remember it's a power of 0.75. So it's related to the lean body mass of the animal and not the total body weight. So we have to take that into account if we're going by body weight. Now, not all animals are created equal, right? Every animal is an individual as well. So it has its own social status, especially when you're talking about herd animals. Every animal has different behaviors. They may have different medical disorders as well that are going to affect the overall feed intake and the overall requirements of that animal, as well as age, right? We've already talked about growing animals requiring a lot more food. So individuals have to be taken into account as well in their certain situations. So when we talk about predicting feed intake, there's a couple other things that affect it as well. So you have to take into account the temperature, the environment, right? When it's hotter, we actually see a decrease in food intake. And conversely, if you think of cold weather, it actually increases food intake. So you have to take temperature into account. And that's this graph on the left. It's just showing this voluntary food intake on the y-axis versus the ambient temperature on the x-axis. So as the temperature increases, the voluntary food intake decreases. Okay. Now, we have to talk about containers too. What do you actually feed the animals in? And this is, for our domestic species, our captive species, as versus wild animals, where their food isn't in containers. But, how is the access to the containers, the cleanliness of the containers? That may affect their feed intake and whether they can actually get to it. If it's not clean, it may deter them from eating or drinking. So you have to take the container and what you're feeding them into account as well.